Welcome to the Parsha theme Shir. It's Parsha Tzav this week. It's also Shabbos HaGadol, and it is a little bit about Pesach as well. And it is for the Refuah Shalem of Moshe Shimon ben Leah Esther Chaya HaLevi. So we start talking about the eternal inner flame. We're continuing to talk about the sacrifices or offerings in the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So God told Moshe that once a sacrificial animal has been slaughtered, the parts of it that are to be burned should preferably be placed on top of the altar during the day. However, if this is not possible, they may still be placed on the altar fire any time throughout the following night. So is Torah Ha'olah. God told Moshe that a sacrifice is still valid if it is placed on the altar at night, for the fire of the altar must burn on it throughout the night. The altar fire that was kept burning throughout the night was kindled during the day. Symbolically, the altar alludes to the Jewish heart. Even when we find ourselves in situations of spiritual darkness, we must keep the divine fire of enthusiasm for God, His Torah and His commandments always burning in our hearts. There is a fire of love for God that burns within every soul. It is the task of the Kohanim, the priests, the spiritual leaders of the generation, to feed and preserve this fire. That's the Alshich. A constant fire shall burn upon the altar, it shall never go out. Shabbos is when we disengage ourselves from all things material. Ritual impurity or tumah represents an opposite state, one of excessive enmeshment in the mundane. Yet the Torah instructs that the fire upon the altar must be kept burning even on Shabbos and even under conditions of ritual impurity. The symbolism is that there are times when we believe ourselves to be above it all, as the spirituality of the moment transports us beyond the so-called trivialities of physical life. Conversely, there are times when we feel overwhelmed by those very trivialities. Says the Torah, the fire on our inner altar can and must be kept burning at all times. No moment in our life is too exalted or too debased to prevent sustaining our passion and enthusiasm in the fulfillment of the purpose to which we were created, which is to raise up to God the materials of our everyday existence. It shall never go out, even during the journeys. Then it was covered with a copper vessel to prevent it being extinguished while they were traveling. We infer that special care must be taken during the journeys of life, the times when a person ventures away from the home environment that fosters his character and integrity, so that the fire in his soul should not succumb to alien influences. That's the Mayana Shel Torah. Now, channeling the inner high priest. So the high priest was required to offer up a special meal offering from flour and oil every morning and every evening. V'hakohen hamashiach tachtov mibanov. And the priest from among Aaron's sons, who is anointed as high priest, must offer up this meal offering. Our inner high priest is the innermost aspect and core of our soul, which is permanently bound to God. This aspect of our soul is that part of us that refuses to participate in any act that constitutes a denial of our connection to God. The classic example of something that disconnects us from God is idolatry, but really any violation of God's will can be considered a form of idolatry, for when we violate God's will, we are serving something other than God, whether it be money, fame, pleasure, honor, or anything else. If we would only realize this fact, nothing could entice us away from fulfilling God's will, whether by dwelling on unholy or depressing thoughts, by speaking unholy or insensitive words, or by performing unholy or destructive actions. In this context, our personal high priestly meal offering is the meditative contemplation through which we channel the innermost core of our souls. Like the high priest's offering, drawing upon the power of this core is necessary both in the figurative morning, when we feel enlightened and inspired, in order to ensure that we channel our energy in accordance with God's will, and in the figurative evening, when we feel confused or uninspired, in order to ensure that we resist the temptation to go against what we know we should be doing. Now, always being thankful and ushering in the messianic era. A person was required to offer up a thanksgiving offering whenever he or she experienced some open example of God's protection or help. Im al toda yakrivenu, if a person is bringing a sacrifice in order to give thanks. In the messianic era, communal sacrifices will continue to be offered up, but there will be no longer personal sacrifices. The sole exception will be the thanksgiving offering. Similarly, we are taught that in the messianic era, all forms of prayer will cease except for prayers of thanksgiving. The purpose of personal sacrifices, other than the thanksgiving offering, is to orient our animal soul toward divinity. Once the process of atonement will have been completed, and we will no longer have the desire to sin, these types of sacrifices will become obsolete. Only the thanksgiving offering will remain, for its function is to express our acknowledgement of our dependence upon God, and this will continue to be the case for all time. Similarly, we will no longer need to pray for our needs. We will not lack anything. Illness and poverty will be matters of the past, and harmony and spiritual sensitivity will become the hallmarks of society. Prayer will consist only of giving thanks as we continuously acknowledge God's benevolence and wonders. We can hasten the Messianic era by emphasizing in our present lives what will be true in Messianic times. Thus, by placing the emphasis of our prayers on appreciating God's great goodness, we hasten the time when this will indeed be our prayers' sole focus. Now, demonstrating our passion and love for God. A constant fire shall burn upon the altar, continually it shall never go out. On this verse, the Jerusalem Talmud comments, continually, even on Shabbos, continually, even in a state of impurity. As we learned previously, every aspect of the physical sanctuary has its counterpart in the inward sanctuary within the soul of the Jew. His heart is the altar, and corresponding to the two altars of the sanctuary, the outer and the inner, are the outer and inner levels of the heart, its surface personality and its essential core. The altar on which the continual fire was to be set was the outer one, and for the Jew this means that the fire of his love for God must be outward, open and revealed. It is not a private possession to be cherished subconsciously. It must clearly show in the face he sets towards the world. And this human fire brings down the fire from heaven. It brings God into the world and draws infinity into the dimensions of the finite. Now, using our initiative, the fire upon the altar shall be kept burning on it, and the priest shall burn wood on it every morning. Although a fire descended from heaven upon the altar, it is also a mitzvah, a commandment, to add to it a humanly produced fire, says the Gemara in Eruvin. This is a rule that applies to all areas of life. The gifts of life are bestowed upon us from above, yet it is God's desire that we add to them the product of our own initiative. That's the Hasidic masters. Now, ethics of animal sacrifice, one view. So according to Rabbi Joseph Albo, the logic of the passage is clear, where it says Noach offers an animal sacrifice in thanksgiving for having survived the flood. God sees that human beings need this way of expressing themselves. They are genetically predisposed to violence. It says in Bereshis, every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. If society is to survive, humans will need to be able to direct their violence towards non-human animals, whether as food or sacrificial offerings. The crucial line to be drawn is between human and non-human. The permission to kill animals is accompanied by an absolute prohibition against killing human beings. For in the image of God, God has made humanity. It is not that God approves of killing animals, whether for sacrifice or food, but that to forbid this to human beings, given their genetic predisposition to bloodshed, is utopian. It is not for now, but rather for the end of days. Until then, the least bad solution is to let people kill animals rather than murder their fellow humans. Animal sacrifices are a concession to human nature. Animal offerings are a substitute for violence directed against humankind. Thus, according to this view, sacrifice, as with meat eating, entered Judaism as a substitute for violence. It also helps us understand the profound insight of the prophets that sacrifices are not ends in themselves, but part of the Torah's vision to create a world redeemed from the otherwise interminable cycle of revenge. The other part of that vision, and God's greatest desire, is a world governed by justice. That, we recall, was his first charge to Avram, to instruct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, it says in Bereshis. Have we therefore moved beyond that stage in human history in which animal sacrifices have a point? Has justice become a powerful enough reality that we no longer need religious rituals to divert the violence between human beings? Sadly, the answer is no. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Cold War led some thinkers to argue that we had reached the end of history. There would be no more ideologically driven wars. Instead, the world would turn to the market economy and liberal democracy. But the reality, as we know, was radically different. There have been waves of ethnic conflict and violence in many countries and regions since. Far from speaking to an age long gone and forgotten, the laws of sacrifice tell us three things as important now as then. First, violence is still part of human nature, never more dangerous than when combined with an ethic of revenge. Second, rather than denying its existence, we must find ways of redirecting it so that it does not claim yet more human sacrifices. Third, the only ultimate alternative to sacrifices, animal or human, is the one first propounded millennia ago by the prophets of ancient Israel, few more powerfully than Amos, who says, "Even though you bring me burnt offerings and meal offerings, I will not be appeased. Rather, let justice be revealed like water, and righteousness like a never-failing stream." Now, uplifting those who feel discarded. Different explanations have been offered for the special significance of the Terumas Hadeshen, the cleaning out the ashes from the altar, for why the daily service in the Beis HaMikdash in the temple began with the Kohen cleaning the surface of the Mizbeach, the altar. The Sefer HaChinuch explains very simply that this was about cleanliness, that it was important for the Beis HaMikdash, the site of the Shekhinah, of God's glory, to be kept tidy. The Chovos HaLevavos writes that the daily avodah, the service, began with this custodial work to humble the Kohen, to remind him that as prominent and distinguished his position was, he was not too important to take out the rubbish, to do menial tasks such as cleaning the Mizbeach, the altar. This should be a lesson to us all, regardless of our exalted positions in life and society. But Rav Simcha Bunim explained that there are people who feel like ash, as though they have been discarded like unwanted rubbish or trash, that they are unimportant. The Kohen begins the service in the Beis HaMikdash by lifting the ashes, the literal translation of Terumas Hadeshen, to symbolize the Kohen's responsibility to uplift the downtrodden, to restore the dignity of self-respect to those who feel discarded, unseen, and unvalued. The Kohanim, the group especially chosen to perform the sacred avodah, service in the Beis HaMikdash, might have seen themselves as too prestigious to concern themselves with the lowly, simple members of the nation, with the daily struggles and challenges faced by the commoners. The Torah therefore commanded the Kohanim to begin their day with an act that reminds them of their obligation toward those who feel lowly and demoralized, that they must do all they can to lift these people's spirits and ensure that they never again feel discarded. Now, expressing gratitude in detail. One of the types of korbanos discussed by the Torah in our Parsha is the korban toda, the thanksgiving offering. A person would bring this korban after experiencing a personal salvation. Specifically, the sages tell us that 4 situations required the offering of a toda, as indicated by a chapter in Tehillim in Psalms 107, which describes 4 experiences for which people must express gratitude to Hashem. Firstly, recovering from illness, then safely traveling through a desert, or safely emerging from a sea voyage, or emerging from captivity. But fascinatingly, Rabbeinu Bechaya, here in Parsha Tzav, adds a 5th situation requiring a korban toda, which is a marriage. The prophet Yirmiyahu foresees the time when the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt, and once again joyous sounds will be heard in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, the sound of happiness and the sound of joy, the sound of a groom and the sound of a bride, bringing a thanksgiving offering to the house of God. This implies that after a couple marries, they would bring a korban toda to express gratitude over the wonderful blessing of marriage. One of the unique features of the korban toda is that it consisted of not only an animal sacrifice, but also bread, chalas matzah, says the verse. Rashi explains that the person bringing a toda was required to bring no fewer than 40 loaves, 10 loaves of 4 different kinds of bread, 3 types of matzah, and 1 type of leavened bread. A number of commentators, most notably the Netziv, explained that the toda was an especially large korban in order to ensure that the person would invite a large number of guests to celebrate with him. The toda was allowed to be eaten only on the day it was offered and the following night, and it was forbidden to leave any of it uneaten. Therefore, a person who offered this korban had no choice but to include other people in his feast, thereby publicizing his good fortune and Hashem's kindness towards him. But why did the Torah require bringing 40 loaves of bread instead of, say, a single large loaf, as we commonly do at weddings today? Rav Shaul Alter answers that the 40 loaves of the korban toda convey an important lesson about gratitude. When a person feels grateful, he needs to focus his attention not only on the overall blessing, but also on each and every detail. Expressing general gratitude, a generic thank you, even sincerely, is not enough. Gratitude should be specific. One needs to look at each detail of a situation and feel and express gratitude, whether to people or to the Almighty. When a person emerges from a serious illness or a serious accident, he should of course feel grateful for being alive, but he should also think about every detail, every limb and every bodily system that is functioning properly, every hospital staff member and all the other people who helped him. The more detailed the gratitude is, the more meaningful it becomes. For this reason, the korban toda included not simply a large challah, but 40 different loaves, symbolizing the detailed gratitude that one must feel and express. Another example of this concept is Dayenu, it would have been enough, one of the songs sung at the Seder night every Pesach. In this song, we go through a long list of kindnesses that Hashem performed for our nation, that He brought us out from Egypt, He struck the Egyptian idols, He killed their firstborn, He split the sea, He sustained us in the desert, He gave us the Torah, and so on. After each line we exclaim, Dayenu, it would have been enough for us. Clearly, though, it would not have been enough for us if Hashem had taken us out of Egypt without then splitting the sea to save us, and without sustaining us in the desert or giving us the Torah. But rather the meaning of Dayenu is that each kindness in its own right requires our appreciation and gratitude, and that we express praise to Hashem. Dayenu demonstrates the principle taught to us by Rav Shaul Alter, the notion that gratitude must be specific and detailed, that we must give attention to each and every blessing that we have received and feel genuinely grateful for each individually. Now, more symbolism of the sacrificial service. As was the case with most offerings, parts of the sacrifices of the inauguration rituals were burned on the outer altar. V'yikach Moshe osam me'al kapehem v'yakter hamizbecha. And Moshe took specific parts of the slaughtered sacrifices from the hands of Aaron and his sons and burned them on the altar. The procedures for the sacrifices all allude to inner psychological processes that we must undergo in order to draw close to God. As we said before, the Hebrew word for sacrifice, korban, means drawing close. Slaughtering the animal alludes to how we slaughter, in other words, renounce our animalistic orientation toward life. Sprinkling the blood on the altar alludes to how we then reorient our enthusiasm, signified by our warm blood, toward godliness. Placing the fat of the slaughtered animal on the altar alludes to how we reorient our sense of delight, which is signified by fat, which results from the delight of indulging in eating foods, toward godliness. Burning the animal by fire on the altar alludes to the consumption of our animal nature by divinity, meaning that our formerly animalistic drives become drives for goodness, as we transform the world into God's home. Now, why is it called Shabbos HaGadol, the Great Shabbos? So various reasons are given for the name Shabbos HaGadol. Some say it is great because of the focus on Torah teaching in advance of the upcoming Pesach festival. Others say it was because of God's instruction to take the Paschal lamb on that fateful Shabbos and tie it to their beds for 4 days. They were about to literally slaughter the god of the furious Egyptians in front of their own eyes. But nevertheless, the Egyptians were miraculously rendered powerless by God to intervene. But Shabbos HaGadol also commemorates the birth of Jewish destiny. Freedom is when one stops bowing down to the idols of his age. We can all ask ourselves, what is my Lamb of Egypt? It can be variously, for example, the search for fame, fortune, pleasure, respect, power, or control. But Shabbos teaches us to stop pretending everything depends on ourselves. The Shabbos HaGadol is when all the idols start to fall, a reminder that we should stand up and confront the idols of our generation. We have to stand up against falsehood, both within the world and within ourselves, and we need to rise above fear and take the first steps towards real freedom. And then, in so doing, we can finally become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, as Hashem requests of us. Now, Pesach, God's historic plan. What was the purpose of the Exodus? An obvious answer is freedom, but this is just one reason. God also had a different purpose in mind. Throughout the biblical account of the 10 plagues that led up to the grand finale of the Israelite slaves leaving Egypt, God repeatedly declared his purpose. So says God, "Through this you will know that I am God." And also, so that you will know that there is none like God, our God. And so that you will know that I am God in the midst of the earth. And for this time I will send all my plagues against your heart, that you will know that there is none like me in all the world. And finally, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt in order to be your God. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, is, according to our sages, a commandment to believe in God, a God who acts in history for our benefit. The bottom line is that God is always in control. He didn't just create the world and then leave it to run by itself. Although human beings have free will in the moral sphere to choose between good and evil, right and wrong, what actually happens is determined by God alone, who loves us dearly and always acts in the world and also in our personal lives for our ultimate spiritual benefit. He is the conductor, and all world events are carried out in perfect synchronicity and in precise consonance with his will by his global human orchestra. Egypt was a mighty ancient empire, the superpower of the time. All of the available metrics could never have predicted that a powerless population of slaves could challenge the mighty Egyptian regime and walk out free. And in fact, until the time of the Exodus, not one slave had ever escaped Egypt before. It could only happen, and did happen, because of the God factor, the power of our all-controlling God to achieve the unlikely, the improbable, and the impossible. Similarly, all that happens in the current war with Iran in our own time is ultimately determined by God, because the same God who took us out of Egypt 3,338 years ago is still bucking the odds and is still in complete control. And finally, a Pesach cleaning tip, which is any place where one's hand cannot reach generally does not need to be checked for chometz, for leaven. And that is the end of Parsha Tzav, Shabbos HaGadol. And God willing, we will return next week with a class on Pesach, as it will be Pesach then. And until then, wishing you a Shavua Tov, a very good week, and a Chag Kosher V'Sameach, a wonderful Pesach. Thank you for watching. Shalom.